For the past half-century, technological innovation and video games have gone hand in hand. As computers got better, games got more complicated and more realistic. We've gone from moving lights around on a screen to 2D pixel graphics to primitive 3D environments to polygons to ray tracing and a whole lot in between along the way. Each of these advancements have gone a long way to make video games look and feel more immersive. But despite all of the advances, there has always been a fundamental disconnect between the player and the game world. Regardless of how well you can suspend your disbelief, no matter how many hairs you can see when you zoom in on Mario's mustache, no matter how many fucking pores you can see on your character, it can only feel so real when you're looking at a screen. When there's a desire, people will engineer a solution. And that solution they've come up with? Virtual reality. You may still be looking at a screen, but the screen is on your face. It's like you're really there! In case I didn't make it apparent enough in the title, I have been an extreme skeptic of virtual reality lately. For years now, believers have heralded VR as the future of not only gaming, but computing in general. It's going to change everything. Just you wait, they say. And the technology behind VR is so cool. It is really fun to play with, but there has been nothing that I've seen that has made me even consider the thought of dropping several $100s on one of these. This isn't even mine. I'm borrowing it from my sibling. Simply put, as a consumer, I'm not convinced. And it's really going to take a lot to change that. It's time we face the reality of virtual reality. Gather round. Let me tell you a story real quick. The date, January 16th, 2014. I came home and logged onto YouTube excited to watch the new daily Dan2DM video. And it would be my first encounter with the bold new technological frontier of virtual reality. In this video, Dan would receive and unbox a pre-release development kit for the original Oculus Rift headset and use it to play Minecraft in VR. This was one of the most mind-blowing things my young mind had ever seen. I was convinced that this was the future of video games. I was witnessing a technological revolution in real time. Everything was going to change. You hear that sound?
Maybe not.
That's foreshadowing. It took us a long time for us to get to that point. The original Oculus Rift was the culmination of countless people trying and failing for years to turn VR from nonsense science fiction technobabble bullshit to an actually viable consumer product. Some would say that the origins of VR are incredibly old. People have been looking at images through silly goggles since basically the invention of photography. In 1838, Charles Wheatstone invented the stereoscope. It showed two slightly different images for each eye, exploiting quirks in our binocular vision to create an illusion of three-dimensional depth. Granted, these are nothing more than a glorified Viewmaster, but you can see that the seeds were being planted. The concept of true virtual reality first appeared in science fiction in the 1930s short story Pygmalion Spectacles, written by the author Stanley Weinbaum, and that title alone makes it sound like the weirdest fucking original Star Trek episode. In this story, the protagonist is given a headset by an eccentric mad scientist, which he uses to experience a virtual world and proceeds to do exactly what you would expect a guy like him or any guy in that situation to do. Fall in love with a video game girl, and then he gets sad when he breaks the headset and remembers that she isn't real. I brought up Star Trek a moment ago, and I just remembered this exact thing has literally been a plot point in several different episodes of The Next Generation. So yeah, I'd say it was pretty ahead of its time. The first thing that could be truly considered a VR headset was the Sword of Damocles. Developed in 1968 by computer graphics pioneer Ivan Sutherland. This thing was a far cry from the Quests and Valve Indexes of today. It consisted of two CRT monitors, one for each eye, and could only display very simple wireframe graphics. Like the headsets that we have today, the device would allow its users to look around by moving their head. It used a series of mirrors to superimpose these computer-generated images onto the surrounding environment. So because of that, I guess you could say that in actuality, it was more like augmented reality than virtual reality. The headset was also really heavy and had to be mounted from the ceiling. Just look at this. This thing is terrifying. It both reminds me of those machines eye doctors have where they flip back and forth between the lenses to figure out how truly fucked up your eyes are, which I've had a lot of experience with in my time, and a Clockwork Orange. It seems like Sutherland and his team were aware of that when they invented this thing though, because the name Sword of Damocles is a reference to an ancient legend wherein the Sicilian tyrant Dionysus I teaches the eponymous Damocles a lesson about how scary being the king is by inviting Damocles to a dinner where a sword is hanging over his head, blade down, suspended only by a horse's tail for the entire meal. Yeah, they knew. This thing was like the Australopithecus of VR. It was primitive and weird looking, but you can see where it's going. But still, things had a long way to go. In the 70s and 80s, VR was an area of active research, but most of this innovation occurred behind closed doors, mostly relegated to computer labs at elite universities, giant companies, and government agencies like NASA. The most notable of these, in my opinion, was NASA's Virtual Interface Environment Workstation, or VIEW, from 1990, which they used to train astronauts. It consisted of a much more familiar looking headset and pair of gloves that astronauts could use to interact with things inside of the simulation. The reason why I brought this one up specifically is because this marked a turning point in VR. The technology was finally getting good enough and cheap enough that a bunch of companies seriously attempted to bring VR to market as a consumer product. Keyword, attempted. Because none of these would really end up catching on. Good old Sega had plans to make a Sega VR add-on for the Genesis, and honestly, it was a smart move they never went through with it, considering how well the Genesis add-ons that were actually released sold. Do you think this thing would sell better than the 32X? Sega did, however, end up successfully developing the VR1 for use at Joyopolis, their Japan-only chain of indoor amusement parks.
Editing Max here again. I was a dipshit baby boy and did not realize that there were Joypolis locations in China, and that it's pronounced Joypolis, not Joyopolis. Whoops.
Arcades and indoor amusement parks like this were where the vast majority of VR use remained for the rest of the 90s. However, some companies did end up bringing VR to market. Most notably among them was the Virtual Boy. What's to be said about the Virtual Boy that hasn't been said already? I did get a chance to play on one of these at Portland Retro Gaming Expo a few years ago. That was a life-changing day. This thing absolutely sucked. It did not have a head strap, so it had to be mounted on a table. Which means for a giant-ass man like myself, who has to spend like 30 minutes every time I film one of these videos framing the shot so my head isn't cut off, I had to crane my ass to the point where I looked like fucking E.T. I played Mario's Tennis on it for maybe about 10 minutes before my eyes and neck began to hurt, and I decided I had enough of whatever this was. But in all honesty, I would be hard-pressed to call this virtual reality. You're just looking at a regular game with a limited color palette of red and black through weird-ass goggles. However, not all of the commercial headsets released in the 90s were absolute crap. The coolest one of these was the Forte VFX-1. The technology for this headset was actually super impressive and very ahead of its time. It let you play certain compatible PC games like Duke Nukem 3D and VR, letting you look by moving your head and accepting button inputs with this weird-ass little circle controller. This very much feels like a precursor to what we got on the market. It is very cool. Shame it retailed for like $700 in 1995, so only the kids whose families own fucking yachts could afford this thing. In the 2000s, the world kind of collectively stopped giving a shit about all this VR stuff. Understandable after the undeliverable promises of the 90s. However, this would all change when a 17-year-old kid named Palmer Luckey invented the very first prototype of the Oculus Rift. Luckey thought he had something big on his hands, so he founded Oculus VR in 2012, launching a Kickstarter campaign that would go on to earn $2.4 million and attract the attention of some of the biggest names in the gaming industry, like Valve CEO Gabe Newell and id Software co-founder John Carmack. Carmack specifically was already really into the idea of VR and joined Oculus as CTO not long after things got going, leading to id's parent company ZeniMax trying to sue the shit out of Oculus. This brings us full circle back to where my knowledge of VR begins, with that fateful Dan TDM video. When the Rift finally ended up releasing to the general public, it started a revolution in the field of VR. Everybody wanted to stick their thumb in that VR pie. Facebook founder and suspected synthetic life form Mark Zuckerberg bought out Oculus for $2 billion, and Palmer Luckey would go on to pursue his other passion in life, killing people. This is also the point where I gotta stop diving into the minutiae, because if I did, we would be here until I turn 40, because shit started getting crazy. On the console gaming front, PlayStation would release PSVR to a collective, that's kind of neat, from the gaming community, while on the PC side, Valve and Taiwanese tech company HTC would release the Vive, with Valve eventually releasing their own premium headset, the Index. While VR was getting cheaper and cheaper, it was still out of reach for most people, and because of that, so many companies tried to make smartphone VR a thing, namely Google with these little cardboard goggles. This was how I first experienced quote-unquote VR in my high school computer science class, and wasn't that good. These things were to VR as those dinky-ass Tiger Electronic handheld games were for the Game Boy. The next couple years were a blur to me. I kinda black out when my memory gets to 2020. And the next thing I remember, the Oculus Quest was coming out, and it was actually pretty cheap. I think all the metaverse stuff that they were trying to do with it was stupid as hell. Stop trying to make the metaverse happen, Mark. But disregarding that, for the first time, VR was reasonably affordable. But I could not bring myself to care. As I brought up earlier, my sibling now owns an Oculus Quest, so I've had a chance to try out VR for myself. It is really fun, but there's nothing about my experience with it that convinced me to drop my own hard-earned money for my own. In fact, it convinced me even more of what I was already suspecting. This is a fad, a gimmick, and the hype will fade away in time. It reminds me of the motion control mania from the Wii 360 and PS3 generation. The Wiimote fucking set the world on fire, and both Microsoft and Sony tried desperately to cash in on that hype with the Kinect and the PlayStation Move, but the whole craze ended up just fizzling out. And do not get me wrong, just like the motion control craze, there are some fantastic games that utilize VR to its full potential. I can't talk about VR without mentioning Half-Life Alyx and the all-time classic Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades. But other than that, none of the games I have played have really wowed me. Most of them just feel like tech demos. There's some definite fun to be had here, but it's not $300 worth of fun. Why would I spend that money I could be spending on far more useful things on a headset that only has a handful of games I could actually see myself sinking significant time into? I was worried about motion sickness going into this, but I was pleasantly surprised to say that that wasn't the case for me. I can get motion sick really easily if I do stuff like read a book or try to play video games while in the car. As a passenger, do not do that while driving. And I've also tried some other headsets in the past that have made me feel kind of weird, but I didn't have any issues with this one. I could imagine this could cause some issues though for people who are really sensitive to being motion sick. After I took off the headset, I did feel a little dissociated from reality. A really bizarre feeling I can't describe. It's like you're not really all there. It did become pretty apparent to me though when actually playing on the headset is that accessibility is going to be a real challenge to people who develop for VR. VR requires a lot of physical movement in the real world, and some people just can't do that for extended periods of time, or even at all. I've reached my calorie target for today. What is the calorie target on this device set to? Video games have already had issues excluding people with various disabilities affecting their senses and motor skills, so this takes it up to a whole nother level. I am also so relieved that the whole metaverse thing seems to have fizzled out, and it's now just a place where dumbasses spend real-world prices on fake video game houses. I always felt that the concept of living in a virtual reality world and interacting with people and carrying out relationships and living and working in it sounds super dystopian. Why would I choose to live my life in a fantasy world ruled by Mark Zuckerberg, the same man whose greatest product is actively eroding democracies around the world? And I really do not want to live in a world where VR replaces our screens like Apple is trying to do with their ridiculously priced Vision Pro headset. I feel like I have seen and experienced enough to form a judgment of my own. And unless something big changes, I can't realistically see myself buying one of these for myself in the future. With headsets like the base model of the Meta Quest now selling for only $300, the same price as the Switch was when it came out, they are now a widely available consumer good and should be scrutinized as such. It's no longer an experimental technology only available to those willing to sell their soul to the devil to afford it. And while the Quest sales numbers are impressive, I don't think that tells the whole story of the actual impact of VR. The VR industry is huge now, but I don't think it's made the same splash in our culture that lots of other things like the iPhone did. And at this point, if it hasn't caught on yet, I don't think it ever will. Let's face it, VR is not the future. It will not be the future of gaming or the future of how we live our lives and interact with other people. The real world is here to stay. VR has been around for a long time, and I don't think it will ever go away. Once the current wave of hype cools off, I can see it settling itself into a comfortable niche with a dedicated enthusiast audience. But for now, VR just isn't for me. And that's okay. You can still like it and make cool things for it, and that's fantastic. But, you know, for me, I think I'll just stick to the regular video games for now. I already find myself getting lost into them enough as it is. The PETA game video was, came out the week before Tears of the Kingdom came out, and then, well, it's August now. With all that said, thank you for watching my video, and I promise you it will not be another 4 months until the next one. Goodbye, and stay safe.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or you will not get an extra scoop of ice cream for dessert tonight.